In a room full of rock royalty, one sentence would ignite a feud nobody in music history was supposed to hear. And it began with Mick Jagger smiling and claiming a song the man who wrote it was standing close enough to hear. London, May 1966. The party wasn't on any poster and no reporter knew the address. A townhouse off Chelsea's King's Road, 3 floors of dim lamps, Persian rugs, and music industry power pretending to be casual. Guitars leaned against furniture like they lived there. Ashtrays overflowed. Champagne bottles crowded a piano nobody was playing. This wasn't a party for fans. This was a gathering for people who were shaping what the 1960s sounded like. Producers, photographers, managers, models, and musicians who had already changed popular music once and suspected they were about to do it again. Near the center of the room, Mick Jagger stood barefoot on a carpet, holding a glass he hadn't touched in 10 minutes, telling a story to a circle of listeners who laughed before he finished sentences because they already expected something clever. Keith Richards sat cross-legged nearby, absently playing a blues riff on an acoustic guitar, not performing, just thinking out loud through strings. The Rolling Stones had arrived together, loud and electric even when silent. They were confidence in human form. But near the balcony doors, almost unnoticed, stood a man in a dark jacket and sunglasses at midnight. Bob Dylan hadn't announced himself. Most people didn't even realize he had come in. He leaned against the wall, watching, hands in his pockets, saying nothing. Dylan rarely liked parties. Fame followed him like a shadow he never invited, and London crowds were louder than New York. He was in England for tour obligations and had only come because a mutual friend insisted. He wasn't drinking. He was studying the room, particularly one person, because the Rolling Stones fascinated him. They weren't folk. They weren't exactly blues either. They were something new. Attitude turned into sound. Dylan had changed lyrics in popular music. The Stones were changing posture. Across the room, a young journalist asked Jagger a simple question. "What's different about rock now?" Jagger paused, thinking, enjoying the attention. "People are listening to words," he said. "Before, you danced. Now you listen." Someone asked why. Jagger shrugged slightly. Because songs started saying something. He paced slowly while he spoke, unconsciously performing even in conversation. You can't just shout baby and love anymore. Audiences want a story. They want meaning. Keith played a small chord change and smirked. "And blame Bob for that," he added casually. Some laughed. Some looked toward the balcony. Jagger followed their gaze and noticed Dylan standing there. For a moment, neither man reacted. Then Jagger raised his glass slightly in acknowledgement and continued. "I mean it," Jagger said, voice louder now. Like a Rolling Stone changed the game. After that record, everything shifted. We all realized rock could say anything. The room quieted. Even conversations across the hall slowed. Dylan still hadn't moved. Jagger kept talking, unaware, or maybe aware, of exactly how close the song's writer stood. "We took that idea and ran with it," he said. "Honestly, we own that energy now. Rock belongs to bands who can deliver it live." The words hung in the air. Nobody breathed. Keith stopped playing mid-note. Dylan pushed himself off the wall and walked forward, slowly enough that every step made people shift aside. He didn't look angry. He looked certain. "You don't own it," Dylan said calmly. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried farther than shouting. The room froze completely. Jagger held his expression, still smiling, but now measuring. "No?" Jagger asked. Dylan shook his head slightly. "You heard a door open," he said, "and you ran through it." A pause. Then he added, "But you didn't build it." Someone coughed. Nobody laughed. Jagger set his glass down carefully on a table. "Rock's bigger than one songwriter, Bob." Dylan nodded once. "Sure," he said. "But before that song, nobody was writing rock songs like letters." Jagger stepped closer. "We didn't copy you." Dylan finally removed his sunglasses. "You copied the feeling," he replied. The tension thickened. Even the record executives, men used to negotiation and ego, avoided interrupting. Keith watched silently, guitar resting in his lap. Understanding history was unfolding in a living room. "You took talking-style singing," Dylan continued. "The phrasing, the sneer, the way words fall ahead of the beat." Jagger's jaw tightened slightly. "We made it louder," he said. Dylan nodded again. "Exactly." Silence. Then Dylan finished. "You turned my folk into rock." No one moved. Not the photographer near the staircase, not the producer by the piano. Because what they were hearing wasn't an argument, it was two definitions of rock music colliding. Jagger finally laughed softly, but not dismissively. "And you turned rock into poetry," he said. Dylan almost smiled. "I just told the truth." For several seconds neither man spoke again. Then Keith strummed a chord deliberately, breaking the spell. Conversations resumed slowly, but the energy had changed. People knew they had just witnessed something private and historic. Two artists who were reshaping music had acknowledged each other. Not as enemies, not as friends, but as rivals occupying the same revolution. Later that night, guests would leave and describe the party differently. Some said it was friendly, others said it was tense. But everyone agreed on one thing. Rock music had just split into two directions, and both men standing in that room were certain theirs was the future. The argument ended that night, but the conversation didn't. It simply moved into recording studios where neither man had to speak directly, because now they could answer with songs. By late 1966, Bob Dylan was no longer in London. He had retreated to upstate New York after his motorcycle accident, a disappearance that only made his influence larger. Musicians kept waiting for him to respond publicly to what had happened at the party, to say something in an interview, to dismiss the Rolling Stones or praise them. He did neither. Instead, he recorded quietly in a basement house in Woodstock with a small group of musicians, playing stripped-down songs that sounded almost casual, almost unfinished, but full of words that felt like conversations overheard in real life. The songs weren't loud. They weren't rebellious in the obvious way. Yet every songwriter who heard them recognized the same thing. Dylan was changing direction on purpose. He wasn't competing with the Stones' volume. He was changing what counted as depth. Meanwhile, in London, the Rolling Stones were doing the opposite. Their sessions became longer, harder, more aggressive. Mick Jagger began rewriting lyrics repeatedly, staying in the studio late after everyone left, reading newspapers, novels, and even poetry between takes. Keith Richards noticed. "You're writing characters now," he told him one night. Jagger shrugged. "People listen to words now." Richards smirked. "You mean since Dylan?" Jagger didn't answer, but he didn't deny it either. Critics began noticing something strange. The Stones' new songs sounded tougher, but also sharper. Sarcastic narrators, observational lines, songs about society instead of just romance. One reviewer wrote, "The Rolling Stones have learned that rock lyrics can be literature." Another wrote more bluntly, "They've absorbed Dylan's storytelling and electrified it." The press loved the comparison. Journalists began asking Jagger the same question everywhere. "Are you influenced by Bob Dylan?" At first Jagger deflected. Then, during a 1967 interview in a Smoky magazine office, he finally responded. "We didn't imitate him," he said carefully. "He showed you could say things in a song. We just proved a rock band could do it louder." The quote crossed the Atlantic within days. A copy of the magazine reached Woodstock. Dylan sat at a kitchen table while a friend read the line aloud. Dylan listened without interrupting, tapping a pencil against the wood. When the friend finished, he asked, "That what he said?" "Yeah." Dylan nodded slowly. "They think loud makes it new." He stood, picked up a guitar, and played a gentle chord progression, soft and almost country. "You don't answer volume with volume," he said. "You answer it with space." Over the next months, Dylan's new material grew simpler, almost intentionally plain, melodies easy, words subtle, stories about ordinary people rather than biting commentary. To casual listeners, it sounded like he'd stepped back. To musicians, it sounded like he'd moved ahead. Because now bands had two choices: follow the Stones' energy or follow Dylan's storytelling. Rock music was splitting into styles. In London, Jagger heard Dylan's new recordings through advanced pressings. He played them in a studio control room after midnight. The band listened quietly. No one mocked them. No one dismissed them. When the final track ended, Keith leaned back and said, "He didn't try to beat us." Jagger nodded. "No," he said. "He changed the game again." A few months later, the Stones recorded darker material. Heavier rhythms, sharper lyrics, songs less about dancing and more about identity and restlessness. A producer joked, "You two are chasing each other across continents." Jagger shook his head. "No," he replied. "We're running the same race in different directions." Neither artist mentioned the party publicly, yet the rivalry became understood among musicians. Every new Dylan release was studied by rock bands. Every Stones record was analyzed by songwriters. When Dylan used quieter arrangements, bands experimented with acoustic textures. When the Stones pushed attitude and swagger, performers amplified stage presence. Without meeting again, they were shaping each other's decisions. One night in a New York club, a young guitarist told his friend, "Dylan writes the thoughts. The Stones write the reactions." The friend nodded. Together, that's rock music now. And neither Dylan nor Jagger had to say another word, because by 1968 their records were speaking louder than any argument ever could. Almost 10 years passed before they stood in the same room again. Madison Square Garden, 1975. Backstage corridors echoed with roadies, cables, and amplifiers humming through concrete walls. Bob Dylan was sitting alone on a folding chair tuning a guitar, not performing yet, just preparing the way he always did, quietly, methodically, like the crowd outside didn't exist. A knock never came. The door opened, and Mick Jagger stepped in. No managers followed. No photographers. Just the two men who had been answering each other through records for nearly a decade. For a moment neither spoke. Jagger looked around the dressing room. "You always keep it simple," he said. Dylan kept turning a tuning peg. "Simple travels easier." A small smile crossed Jagger's face. He leaned against the wall. "Funny thing, that party in London. People still think we argued." Dylan shrugged. "We didn't argue. We explained ourselves." Jagger nodded slowly. "You know, when like a Rolling Stone came out, every band realized songs didn't have to be shallow anymore." Dylan looked up. "And when your band hit the stage, every songwriter realized words had to survive a loud room." Silence settled between them. Not tense now, just reflective. Jagger finally said, "We never owned that song." Dylan replied, "Nobody does once people hear it." Jagger laughed softly. "We just carried it somewhere else. And made it dangerous," Dylan added. Jagger extended his hand. Dylan looked at it for a second, then shook it. No ceremony. No witnesses. Just recognition. They weren't rivals anymore. They were proof of the same change. Rock music hadn't been created by one man or one band. It had grown because one wrote words people felt, and the other made crowds feel them at full volume. Outside, thousands of fans were waiting. Inside, the feud quietly ended. Not with an apology, not with a victory, but with understanding. Dylan picked up his guitar and headed for the stage. Jagger stepped aside to let him pass. As Dylan walked by, he said one last thing. "Songs don't belong to musicians." Jagger raised an eyebrow. "Who do they belong to?" Dylan opened the door to the sound of the crowd roaring. "The people who need them."